Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another lecture with us here. Look at this adorable picture of Amelia. This is right after shower time. She was feeling a little bit tired and she was laying down, and she doesn't do this much anymore. When you guys grow up, if you eventually have kids, one of the best things in the world, and you should cherish it while they want to do it, is when they're little babies and you hold them, they'll just rest their head on your shoulder and they'll just kind of melt into you, and it's the best feeling in the world. And then they get older and they don't want to do it anymore, except for sometimes right after they get out of the shower and they want to do it. So it's great. It's going to lay into you. It's very nice. So anyway, that's Amelia for today. This is going to be our last topic for imperialism here. There's a little bit more we could squeeze in, but in the interest of trying to honor that 200 minutes a week per class that we are aiming for in distance learning, I'm going to kind of cut out our Southeast Asia and Middle East topic. Hopefully that doesn't come around to bite us later, but I can't imagine it will. If it becomes an issue, we'll cover it when we need to cover it, but I'd prefer to give you guys the timing experience you're supposed to have rather than trying to overload you with work, because we've got other things we're doing in addition to lecture as well. So our last topic then for imperialism is India. And as you notice down here, India actually has a nickname during this time period. It's the jewel in the crown. Specifically to extend that nickname, it's the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. So India is very much going to be the colony for Britain. If you're the jewel in the crown, right? You got this crown and it's got other colonies that make it up. But the big centerpiece, the most important colony is India. And we're going to see why here as we go through this. So much like we got background on China with the Qing dynasty, there is some relevant background for India when it comes to especially things like religion. So India's interesting because it's actually got several native religions. You start out with Hinduism, which is kind of the default religion of India, but Buddhism also comes from India, and Sikhism also comes from India. It's kind of like an offshoot. It's a different version. It's a synchronization of multiple religions within India that then become its own religion. And then on top of those native religions of India, you have a imported religion coming from a region that's right next door, the Middle East. You have Islam. So what you end up with then is a very overall mixture. Majority of India are Hindu. 83% of Indians at this time period, not in modern India, I'd have to look up numbers for modern India, but at this time period, 83% of Indians are Hindu. Then you get 11% that are Muslim, and then 6% is the remaining other religions like Buddhism, Sikhism, some Christianity in there as well, but that's mostly from Europe. So the main thing then is going to be Hindu compared to Islam. Hindus believe in many gods. In Hinduism, there are multiple gods, just like there are multiple other religions, and that's just how it goes. Muslims, much like Christians, believe in one God. In fact, they believe in the same one God. So that, from the get-go, is going to be a big difference because both of those can't really be the true at the same time, right? They can't coexist at the same time. They also are going to have a lot of individual beliefs that are going to become problems moving forward as well. Hindus and Muslims in India generally don't get along, and that goes into modern world history, where we then get Pakistan and India kind of splitting apart out of that. Basically, this is not going to end well. This is bad for the internal unity of India, and when it comes to imperialism, what we see a lot is just bad timing for certain areas. Like China, for example, if the Qing dynasty was stronger and had less internal problems, they probably could have stood up to Europe, even though they weren't, as technologically as advanced as them. India as well, if they had less internal strife, if they had a stronger government, they might have been able to stand up to Britain, but because of things like this, they don't. So this is not going to end well for India, and it's going to be causing a lot of problems for them. Those problems come from conflict. There's a lot of conflict in Indian history between Hindus and Muslims. This weakens the country, makes it easier to be conquered by an outside force, like, I don't know, Britain, for example. I also just noticed that for some reason this picture is behind the design on the background. Again, I think I mentioned before, my program at home screws up PowerPoint formatting. That's just, it's weird because it's in front of this part, but behind this part. Completely sidetracked. But look at that fat cat. He's a kitty that is big old fatty kitty. So, yeah, India going to get conquered by an outside force pretty easily because they have been weakened by things like this religious conflict. So when we get to imperialism in India, that's going to be a problem. I will maybe have to exit out and just show you guys this slide. I thought I fixed it beforehand. I guess I did not. So it's time for some on-the-fly fixing of slide stuff. See, look at how terrible this program is. It's so bad. Let's just really quickly make sure that none of the other... Oh, you guys getting a sneak preview of something that's terrible later. All right, cool. Let's go back to this now. If I was a true professional, by the way, I would just restart, but ain't nobody got time for that. So imperialism in India is going to start with Britain, but it's going to start with a very specific part of Britain. It's going to be this group called the British East India Company. And as their name implies, they are a business. They're a trading company. But they get a huge amount of government involvement because they make a lot of money for the British government, which means that they want the British East India Company to be successful. They want them to do well. So they start trading in the 1600s with India, and the British government starts backing them up because, again, money. In particular in India, much like we saw in China, there's a lot of raw materials. That is why India is going to get that nickname of the jewel in the crown, because India's got a lot of stuff that Britain wants, whether it's, you know, things like palm oil for running their actual like businesses, like a source of growing cotton, a source of like minerals and iron and stuff like that. All of that is going to be available in India. Plus, you have a huge workforce with a lot of people you could utilize if you know you don't really care about basically employing slave labor. Then you've got the idea of like a huge market you could sell stuff to. Like, you're gonna get that stuff from them. So Britain is going to end up, as we have seen in other areas, and I'm kind of fast forwarding how it happens at this point because we know how it happens. They push their way in there, they overpower the government, they kick them out. So they're going to end up getting a lot of control in India. And this is actually going to have some positives and some negatives. We've seen some of those positives already when we looked at industrialism in India. The British are going to help build roads. They're going to help with education. They're going to help with farming, transportation, communication. Now, the majority of these they're doing for themselves. You need better communication to get your, communication through your areas in India. You need better transportation to move the goods and to sell stuff to them. You need better roads for that better transportation. But regardless of why they're doing it, this does actually end up helping India a little bit. However, the negatives, as always, are going to be a lot stronger. Of course, you have the same negatives you see in every other colony, right? Where their resources are being taken, they're being treated poorly. There's going to be like violence, and it's targeted towards them. But in India, you also have the cultural aspect of it. The British come in, and India has a very rich culture and tradition. They're one of the oldest countries, the oldest societies in the world, so they've built up a very long culture, and Britain goes, yeah, but we like our culture more, and that means that you should not be allowed to have your culture. They are going to force them to assimilate, in other words. That forced assimilation is going to be forced assimilation into the British lifestyle, not the Indian lifestyle. And this is going to have a long-term impact on India. They're, of course, going to exploit the heck out of those Indian workers, which means that for, the average person in India, if you're poor and you're suffering through that, this is not good for you. You are, as I mentioned earlier, basically going to be used as slave labor. You're going to be utilized to the extent that Britain wants to utilize you. Enter Sepoy Rebellion. So I mentioned ignoring culture and tradition. And you might be like, oh, come on, they're a bunch of snowflakes. Like, ooh, their culture is ignored. How does that hurt you? Well, here's one of many examples of how it might hurt you. The Sepoys were Indian soldiers utilized by the British. And a lot of times, if you were a Sepoy, you had very little control over, your choice for being a Sepoy. So you're an Indian soldier, and these Sepoys, by the way, are actually used pretty extensively. Like when we look at World War I troops, British Commonwealth soldiers are just counted as British soldiers. So a lot of times when you see like British casualties, Indian troops actually fought for Britain in World War I, even in Europe. They don't really generally get listed as Indian troops, though, because they're British troops, so we'll just include them in those British numbers. So these are soldiers that actually do fighting for Britain. They're involved with Britain. And because they're Indian, think about what that means for their religion. Chances are they're Hindu, and then there's going to be a decent number of them that are Muslim as well. And think about food restrictions for those groups. Because the gun cartridges at this time period, keep in mind, we're not talking, like machine guns and stuff. This is 1857. This is even before, this is over half a century before World War I. They're not running around with machine guns and stuff like that. They're going to have rifles. And think about how those old school rifles worked, right? You've got basically a flask of gunpowder. You've got the cartridge then that is sealed up with that. And you can't let moisture into gunpowder. Because if you know anything about gunpowder, what happens if you get moisture into it? Doesn't work anymore. So how do you keep moisture out? Well, you make your cartridge out of leather or something that is going to be fairly waterproof. It's not going to let moisture in. But then you've got an opening at the top. You've got to seal that up to make sure no water gets in. And a really good sealant to not let water in is grease or fat. And generally, where does grease come from? Animal fat. So the gun cartridges were sealed with beef fat or pork fat, and there was really no distinction made between the two of them or anything whatsoever. So how would that then tie in with that Muslim and Hindu thing I was talking about? Well, if you're Muslim, what are you not supposed to eat? Pork. And if you're Hindu, what are you not supposed to eat? Beef. It is a religious thing. You are not supposed to do it. And if you are a devout Muslim or Hindu, you follow that. And at this time period, many of them were. Well, Britain doesn't care because they don't really care about Indian culture. They care about British culture. And in British culture, it doesn't matter what your gun cartridges are sealed with because, whatever. The Sepoys find out because the British never even bothered to tell them what they're sealing these cartridges with. And the Sepoys find out about it. And I do realize at this point I have left a very important thing out of this. They're beef and pork fat sealed, but they're not eating the gun cartridges, right? So why is it a problem? Well, here's the problem. When you are in combat, in one hand, you are holding your gun. In the other hand, you are holding your cartridge with the stuff you need to arm your gun. In the middle of combat, are you going to put your gun down so you could use your free hand to open up that seal that's going to be super slippery because of the grease and probably hard to get a handle on? No, of course not. You're not going to put your gun down. So how do you open that cartridge? You hold it in your hand, you bite the seal, and you pull to take the seal out. So you're biting directly into that grease, directly into that fat. So the Sepoys find out that this is how they are sealed, and they go, what the hell, Britain? How about either you seal them with something else, or, worst case scenario, just mark which ones are sealed with what. Mark the ones that are sealed with pork fat, because the Hindu soldiers, they can bite into that no problem. There's nothing against eating pork in Hinduism. And then mark the ones that are used with beef, and the Islamic soldiers, they could use those ones, because you could eat beef, that's fine. So, simple problem, right? Or simple solution, I should say. Britain goes, yeah, but we don't care. And they refuse. So the Sepoys rebel. But unfortunately, because again, that religious division, they're not organized. You have the Islamic Sepoys and the Hindu Sepoys that are kind of working separately. They've got weak leadership. They're going up against a much stronger force, and the Sepoy Rebellion fails. But this is a direct example of how ignoring those local cultures results in violence. It results in bloodshed. Because Britain didn't want to do something as simple as just acknowledge the fact that maybe they need to be a little bit careful with what they seal their cartridges with. I apologize in advance for the next meme. Not because it's a bad meme, it's actually one of my favorite memes, but because it's going to be stuck in your brain forever. It's Ariana Gandhi, you guys. Look at Ariana Gandhi. It's terrifying. Okay, so at this point, much like we saw with Korea and with China and basically anywhere that gets imperialized, you get a lot of nationalism. You get a lot of anti-imperialist, pro-your country nationalism, and India's no exception to this rule. Indians, especially, like rich, high-ranking Indians that had previously had power in government, start demanding a much greater role in the government of the colony. These upper-class Indians are becoming educated, they're getting more views on democracy, they're actually studying things like law and stuff like that. Gandhi actually studies law. He goes to South Africa, he practices law, he comes back to India, so that's all going to lead eventually to Gandhi, who, as we get into like World War II, is going to start pushing for independence of India and eventually get that. So that nationalist movement is going to eventually be part of what forces Britain out of India. So I guess I jumped ahead of myself here because I was thrown off by that wonderful picture of Ariana Gandhi here. We also have Gandhi First Blood. You must be the change you want to see in the world. That's the quote that's above our 500 hallway right there. So just remember, Gandhi with a machine gun. Like that's what he's all about. He wants to be that change. So again, he's educated in Britain, he practices law in South Africa, he goes and helps the Indian independence movement, he gets worldwide attention for his methods of protest, the whole idea of nonviolence, for his belief of nonviolence and passive resistance. This is going to be a huge part of what eventually gets independence for India. Unfortunately, Gandhi does die not too long after that. This is always where I like to point out, by the way, this is not super important for imperialism, but I do think it's really important that when we look at our icons in history, we need to be able to recognize that they are not imperfect, right? Like I think it's dangerous to hold up people as like symbols of like, there, everything that's good in the world. So Gandhi, a lot of good stuff. Definitely the idea of passive resistance and nonviolence. That's going to inspire civil rights movement in America. It's going to have huge impacts. He helps get independence for an entire country. However, he also did such incredibly questionable things as when he got older, he wanted to prove that, because he had some Buddhist beliefs going on, he wanted to prove that he was not tempted by worldly desires, because that's a part of Buddhism, right? You're not tempted by like the desires of the world or money or things like that. You're not tempted by flesh, the idea of like sexual contact with people. So he decided that the best way to show that he was not tempted by sexual desire is he would sleep naked next to his 13-year-old niece. True fact about Gandhi. If you're doubting me, you can look it up. It is very well documented. Which, what the hell, Gandhi? Like, I guess he wants to show that he's not, susceptible to desire. That's fine. But, like, why 13 years old? And why your niece? Odd choice. So, random Gandhi fact there. Lots of good things, but also slept naked next to his 13-year-old niece to show that he was not going to give in to temptation, which is just creepy as hell. So, that's Gandhi for you. He does have a lot of Buddhist ideology beyond that, like, avoiding the temptation of the flesh sort of thing. So no material possessions, tolerance of all people and beliefs. So he actually had a really hard time in India trying to get the Hindus and the Muslims on board with each other because in addition to, trying to get independence, they were also really butting heads with each other. And Gandhi was constantly trying to be like, hey, how about, bring them together a little bit here. He wasn't, however, super kind to the Sikhs in India. So generally, if you know a Sikh and you talk to them about Gandhi, they're probably not going to be a huge fan of him. So again, good stuff on some parts of things, maybe not so good on other parts of things. But, comparatively in India, he was pretty tolerant of religions and beliefs and people. He didn't want to use violence. He said civil disobedience. So satyagraha was the idea of nonviolent resistance to laws that are unjust. And that then, again, gets carried over into, like, MLK's beliefs on nonviolence are directly taken from Gandhi. He's inspired by Gandhi, and he wants to do that. And it has a huge effect because we saw how the Sepoy Rebellion went, right? When you go head-to-head against Britain, they're gonna win. But when you use that civil disobedience to get like media attention and global international attention, then those other countries start putting pressure on Britain and go like, Britain, what the hell, man? Like these like Gandhi would literally go on starvation strikes. Like he would refuse to eat, and people would be like, dude, why are you making this old Indian dude starve to death because you want to control his country? What the hell, Britain? So that puts a lot of pressure on them to then like follow through and leave the country, which is going to be one of the big things that eventually does cause that. So again, good job on that, Gandhi. Maybe not so good job on, you know, the other stuff. But thanks for listening, you guys. You're going to have one of your favorite things in the entire world to go along with this one. It's one of those CFAs, luckily for us. This is not really a multiple choice test, so we don't have to worry about like cheating or what have you, because you can't really cheat on this one. So we're still going to assign it. It's going to go into the grade book as one of those common formative assessments. And you'll just have to do it on Google Docs and turn it in typed up. So as always, just let me know if you have any questions or concerns with that stuff. Thank you guys for watching. Have a good day. Bye.